All right, hello everybody. I thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I know we've got a pretty full house, so if you're comfortable with it, I'll ask everybody to make sure they're kind of squished together. We've got some seats left up the front for those of you who just
There's 3 seats.
And I'll grab more for the back of this. All right, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is fantastic. This is Left Bank Books Presents Washington University Professor Danielle Dutton, who will be here to discuss her new book, Prairie, Dresses, Art, Other. Danielle will be in conversation tonight with author and Professor Kathryn Davis. We are delighted to have them both with us tonight. So some notes before we begin. Today's event is only possible because of all of your support. When you support us at Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it helps out our bookstore, but it also helps keep your streets paved and your parks clean and all those other amazing things. So thank you for supporting us and allowing us to support authors. We also want to extend a welcome to our virtual audience. Thank you for being here from wherever you are. You'll be able to participate in the Q&A at the end by leaving your question as a YouTube comment. So thank you so much for being here. We have a fantastic calendar of events coming up at Left Bank Books. This Thursday at 7 p.m. we'll be joined by Maryville University Professor Jess Bowers with her new short story collection, Horse Show, which explores how humans have used, abused, and spectacularized their equine companions throughout American history. At that evening, we'll also be joined by WashU fellow Travis Masati to discuss his new poetry collection, Apocryphal Genesis, which serves as a reminder of how deeply personal and impersonal world can feel. This event and many more are featured on our website, left-bank.com. There's a full calendar of events for readers of all ages, so go ahead and check that out when you're okay. So today we are delighted to be highlighting the work of Danielle Dutton. Danielle is the author of Margaret the First, SPRAWL, and Attempts at a Life. Her writing has appeared in magazines and journals including The New Yorker, Harper's, Paris Review, Bomb, The White Review, and Newman. Dutton teaches at Washington University in St. Louis and is the co-founder and editor of Dorothy, a publishing project. Born and raised in California, she has lived on the former Prairie for nearly 20 years. Her new book is Prairie, Dresses, Art, Other, a prose collection that critics describe as luminous and brilliantly odd. In the 4 eponymous sections of Prairie, Dresses, Art, and Other, Dutton imagines new models for how literature might work in our fractured times. Out of these varied materials, Danielle builds a haunting landscape of wildflowers, black holes, violence, fear, virtual reality, abiding strangeness, and indefinable beauty. Kirkus Star Review calls it a shimmering and perplexing work that challenges the constraints of traditional prose. It is highbrow while remaining mischievously playful, and it is a form-smashing thrill. We are also honored tonight to be joined by Kathryn Davis. Kathryn is the author of 8 novels, the most recent of which is The Silk Road, as well as the memoir Aurelia, Aurelia. She has received the Kafka Prize for fiction by an American woman, both the Morgan Dowling Zabo Award and Catherine Ann Porter Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2006, she won the Lannan Foundation Literary Award. She is the senior fiction writer on faculty of the writing program at Washington University in St. Louis. So 2 fantastic guests with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Davis and Danielle.
Is this working? No. Told you. Oh, it's got a light. Yes. Now can you hear me? Look closer to you. Now can you hear me? There we go. Now how am I going to be able to read? It seems sort of naughty. So the one thing you get to be able to do when you are not the person whose book it is that is being honored is to say, this is an absolutely amazing book. And you all ought to buy at the very least 1 copy. and we're going to talk about why it is so wonderful and why you need to buy many copies of the book.
Sounds good.
So, so I love this book. This book, I will say of this book something that one really should never say about a book. This book is full of holes. Quite literally. As Danielle says in one of the stories in the book, Not Writing, I want a story to be a hole I fall inside of. Prairie dresses art other ends with Alice, who, as we all know, fell inside a hole and ended up in a pool of tears. The book also begins with a story that begins with a hole, and Danielle is going to read to us from that story.
Yes, so Kathryn picked my readings for this evening, which was fun. So I'm going to read from the first story in the book, which is called Nocturne, but I'm only going to read the first half of it. So this should just take 4 to 5 minutes. Nocturne. From the back seat, her son explains what would happen if she got sucked into a black hole. Moon-faced flowers are wild sweet potato, with heart-shaped leaves and hairy seeds, white and alive in the night. It's a perfect example of exponential growth, he says. In summer, the light stays long. Cicadas apocalyptic with the windows rolled down, fast down the hill toward the river, heading home. On the opposite bank, an oil refinery spreads into Kentucky, its tall stacks shooting flames into the sky. Imagine your body being split in 2 halves, he says. West Virginia is wild. It's right there on the signs. Montani Semper Liberi. Montani Semper Liberi means mountains are always free. Then imagine both halves of your body being split in half, and those halves being split in half, then those halves being split in half, and then those halves being split in half. So you just keep splitting your pieces until you are only molecules. You were only molecules, she thinks, and those sweet potato flowers like a million wagging moons. Mom, he says, are you listening? In a story she read last week at the beach, a man in a straw hat cut off a duck's head while the children stood and watched. Lid, 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 the man called. Quack, 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 said the duck. Then the head fell to the grass, and the duck's feet ran its bottom half away. Yes, she tells him. Yes, she shouts over the wind. It's the hottest week in the world. In Sweden, a forest fire has crossed the Arctic Circle. In Oman, the overnight low is 120 degrees. Near a small German town famous for its asparagus, long deserted bombs are exploding beneath the trees. And just downstream in Czechia, a hunger stone has emerged in the Elbe, the water having hit a record low. If you see me, weep, it reads. The words etched desperately 4 centuries before. A second message emerges upriver. We cried, and you will cry. But the dead are loud as toasters. The fish flap in the mud. Meanwhile, farther north, seen only from the sky, ghostly landscapes rise up via drought. The blueprint of an 18th century mansion on a lawn, a World War II airfield beneath a Hampshire farm, an elaborate Victorian garden long ago cut down. Looking at the drone shot of that non-house on her phone, she thought of pressed flowers gone brown. No, those cyanotypes of seaweed she saw once on display. A woman named Anna Atkins had laid carefully dried specimens on chemically treated paper. Left out in the sun, the seaweed burned its own pale shadow onto a deep blue page. The smell of Kentucky is flammable, damp, the refinery like a spaceship. This blue drama, that exhibition was called. In 1672, her son informs her, a man named Robert Boyle read an entire magazine by the light coming off a piece of rotting veal. From Delaware to Kentucky, they counted 15 dead deer by the side of the road. Once the sun set, the deer began to glow. It was a neck, he says. It was this disgusting fatty piece of baby cow neck. At a cement table by a grassy field, they eat warm melon and pretzels and hard-boiled eggs. A red-winged blackbird trills on a stalk. An old man in the darkened lot moves toward them like a glacier. I love summer, her son says, oblivious to the stranger, listening to cicadas ringing on and on. We should just keep driving to wherever it's summer, and when it's not summer there, we should drive to wherever it's summer next. The air is thick with meadow grass and buds. On the one hand, on the highway, traffic rushes past, but pale moths twist over the field as if there were no time. A part of her whirls outward with those moths, out and out to native plants as weedy as her kid, a crooked stem aster, a blazing star. When she was small, smaller than he is now, and quiet, much quieter than him, her mother wallpapered their apartment in a stylized jungle print. The leaves on the banana trees curled away like ribs. The eyes of the jungle cats looked out like human eyes. Every night, when the lights clicked off, she saw men stepping between the leaves and right off of the walls. At last, the stranger has arrived. Hello, she says. Her son turns. The old man opens a toothless mouth. He is trying to tell them something, and they are trying to hear it, but it takes him 30 years to get it out. I know, she says, when he is done. He turns his gaze to the clamorous field. No, he shakes his head. You've got a long way to go. Stop.
I just love that.
Thank you.
So I wanted you to read from the beginning of the book because am I bugging you into this? Because it indicates in a way something about the journey we're about to be going on in the course of the book. And despite the fact that the book seems to be peculiar in its construction, reading it, I found it to be every bit as propulsive a narrative in its own way as, Charles Dickens. I mean, there's a way you've constructed this book, beginning with the holes and the fact of a black hole and the sort of mystery of what is meant by that I felt I was following throughout the course of the book. And so what I would like to ask you is, how did you go about putting the parts of this book together so that we really do move from a genuine beginning to an ending that you'll all be hearing that also has to do with a whole?
Well, first I just wanted to say thank you for being here with me, Kathryn. And it's a very beautiful day during a very difficult and distressing time. And I just wanted to also say that I appreciate all of you being here, and it makes me happy to see all of your faces here. As for the construction of this book, I don't really know. I was just okay, so there's fairy dresses, art, other. There are 4 very distinct pieces, but there are holes that run throughout the book, that's true. So maybe they're like wormholes that connect you from one part to another so that it feels like you're always sort of close to all the other parts. But I think there's also just certain obsessions or interests of mine that are carrying across the book. And then the very last piece is a play called Pool of Tears, starring Alice and a bunch of animals who are swimming in the lake or a pool of tears. And someone just gave me a reading of the whole book that I'll just share because I don't know how to tell you how to read the book, but I love it because in Pool of Tears there's an avocado. There's something called the new avocado, and it's been genetically engineered to have no pit. And Alice is saying, it's explaining that when she first got to Pool of Tears, she asked her cab driver, David, if he had ever, it was designed that way so that you wouldn't waste your time on the pit and also so that you wouldn't cut your palm. And so she asks him did you ever cut your palm taking out the pit from an avocado? And David has never cut his palm, and she also had never cut her palm, and she's very disturbed by the new avocado, which I'm very disturbed by the new avocado. And so this person's theory was that, and then later that she hears about it on the radio in a cab, and then the lady on the radio is like, is there a hole? And then the man on the radio is like, no, there's no hole. It was like it was never there at all. And then the woman says, no hole. And she sounds really, really, okay. So I think something, this person's theory was that like the hole is still there. It's like we all know something's wrong, even though there's no hole. And I like that as the reading for the whole entire book. It ends with the new avocado, as it was meant to. But the weird thing is, the iteration of this book that Maisha took out did not have Pool of Tears in it, which is insane to me because I do really feel like the book doesn't quite work without that piece, which is now the last piece in the book. But sometimes it's just really hard to see something, you know, or longer than you would expect. But when I finally put it in, I was like,
Well, I also felt like, so the first section, Prairie, is mostly what I would call stories.
Mhm.
And then there's dresses, which just breaks apart the idea of narrative and yet is in a way a sort of, for me, a look deeply into the possible things that you could find in each one of these stories. And then I felt like art was a way of explaining how the things you look at and the things you write work together. So it was sort of a gloss on the first two sections. And then the final section just sort of blows it all apart in a really, really exciting way.
thanks. I do think the first three sections are super distinct, and then the fourth section is like extruded from them somehow.
It is, it's an extrusion.
Yeah. Also sounds snobby.
But so another one of the elements in the book that has to do with the wholes, I think, and with the way the different parts are working together. I thought of it's in one of the last sections in the double room, where you have quoted Cristina Rivera Garza saying, "Short story is the name we have chosen to describe the production of the cultural and social space in which something hidden becomes visible and therefore shared, but still as a secret." And it seems to me that in your book, always two things are going on this way, all the time.
Mm-hmm. That is from Cristina Rivera Garza's introduction to the new and selected stories of Cristina Rivera Garza, which Dorothy published two or 3 years ago, which I highly recommend. But yeah,
I recommend it too.
yeah, it's very good, translated by Sarah Booker mostly. Yeah, I guess that's what I love about the short story as a form, is just how it doesn't ever have to say, really. It feels, I think what I'm excited about with short stories is that they feel like weird experiences, and that's how they feel particularly related to my experiences looking at visual art. I'm not sure like a super long novel can sustain that feeling that I'm after, although a really short novel can, maybe like SPRAWL, maybe, but yeah, that feeling, that sort of inarticulate feeling of strangeness that I get when I'm looking at visual art is also a feeling I'm excited in like producing or experiencing from the short story as a form a lot of the time.
So I'm really interested in knowing, I guess this has something to do with sort of your lineage. So what was the first thing that happened to you where you felt the contact with art in the most splendid way? Was it a visual experience or was it with a book?
I felt like I had no idea what you were just gonna ask.
Good.
My most first splendid experience with art. Well, I think I was just talking about this, so apologies if anyone just heard me say this, but I really do think it was with Beatrix Potter's story, The Tale of Two Bad Mice. Because I was obsessed with that story. Yeah, it was definitely stories. I really loved being read to as a child. My dad was obsessed with reading Goodnight Moon, which I found horrifying for some reason. So it was a very intense experience. It's sitting right there, taunting me. I like it now. I'm fine with it. But A Tale of Two Bad Mice by Beatrix Potter, I was obsessed with, and read it to myself, but really liked it being read to me. And I think the reason, like, I can literally trace my lineage. Here we go. As a writer, first of all, Hunka Munka and the other one are naughty. Does anyone remember the other one's name? Anyway, they're naughty mice, and this was not what interested me. You would think this would be the exciting part, but actually their naughtiness was very upsetting to me. But what was fascinating was there's a dollhouse. They want to go into the dollhouse in the nursery, and they like start living in there like it's their house because it fits them. And I was obsessed with the dollhouse in the story, and I didn't mind that there was like a narrative occurring. That was fine. It was actually nice, but I kind of liked the narrative in the background and the dollhouse in the foreground of the story. And I feel like that says a lot about me as a writer. I'm really interested in fictional spaces, and I like there to be a feeling of narrative, which is quite seductive and strange. I want it going on, but I want it in the background. Whereas I think most people want narrative in the foreground and the spaces in the background. So I trace it all back to A Tale of Two Bad Mice.
But there must have been pictures in that book.
There were pictures, but it was being read to. I don't remember being like, show me the pictures. The kitty is here. Hello. Yeah, in terms of a splendid visual experience, I really have no idea. I had a little pewter unicorn with a big crystal on its head. It was splendid. It made rainbows on my wall.
So it wasn't like you went to an art museum when you were a kid and you...
No.
So when did you first get knocked out by visual art?
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in like a rural space in which there was not much visual art to be had, but I sort of wound up at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for my MFA, and one of the neat things about that, besides that I took like fiber arts classes, was that you got a free pass to the museum, which I went into almost every single day, and would spend a lot of time there. And there are lots of very specific things I can talk about that I was like strangely drawn to, like a porcelain pillow. But one of the most shocking experiences I had was when I went to a Gerhard Richter retrospective, and I didn't know who he was or what was happening. And I remember walking through one room, and then I walked into the next room, and I was like, oh, I must have left that retrospective. And then I went back, and then I was like, wait a minute. And in every room was like a completely different artist's work, but it was all Gerhard Richter. And so that was also sort of like formative visual experience for me, that someone could have so many different projects inside of them or different styles or ideas. And I liked all of them. What's yours?
With visual?
Yeah.
Visual?
You went to art school.
I went to art school, but before that, what I remember is going with my mother and my little sister to the Vincent van Gogh exhibit at the Philadelphia Museum. And the main thing I remember is that I had gotten a catalog. I wanted the book. And I fell down the steps in front of the museum, not all of them, if any of you know the Philadelphia Museum, but I fell down a lot of steps and skinned both my knees, and all of that together was sort of like Vincent van Gogh.
But you grew up in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So yeah, you had city.
Oh yeah, we had, and my mother was an artist. She painted lampshades, but it was.
How did I not know that?
Is it
Nina
March?
Boy.
Yes.
Yeah. There's the cat right behind
I know.
you.
So speaking of Nina Loy,
Mhm.
so one of the stories, Lost Lunar Apogee. Oh, are we almost out of time? Oh my
I'm just telling
goodness.
you what time it is.
Okay, maybe I won't go there.
Okay.
Maybe I'm gonna go somewhere else.
Okay.
Okay, because I do have something I'm very curious about, which is, so we all know when we write, people always say, you know, you're writing for, there's certain people you're writing for, you know, you're thinking of them. Okay, so there's that. But then there are also the people who you write and you show your work to and say, what do you think? And you say, what do you think of that?
That cat does not want to be interviewed.
So I am very interested in the fact that you are, as everybody here knows, in a marriage with another writer.
Mhm.
And I am always interested in how, whether you show one another your work and whether that kind of conversation is sort of, you know, critically important to what you're doing.
This is so interesting. This has really changed over the course of our marriage. But when we were much younger, I showed Marty things like I would write like a half a page and I'd be so excited. Like Marty would come home from work and I'd be like, read it. Like the second I walk in the door and let's talk about it. And I don't know why. I just had this like strange enthusiasm. This was even before I had a book, you know, I just wanted to be read so badly. And I really respected Marty's opinion. I know, just that everything changed. But I still respect Marty's opinion. But no, I have mellowed out as a sharer of my work. Quite a bit, and Marty has never been much of a sharer of his work with me, which might be because I'm a much more brutal reader, as some people here might even know.
Who says yes?
Yeah,
I just said it was true. That's the reason why.
right,
It's
but
not a
he
share.
doesn't want to show me until it's like done, and sometimes even someone else has read it. So I'm not even always Marty's first reader. But we're also very, very different writers, and we're different readers too. Almost the only place we really overlap is Dorothy, where we agree on things and get excited about the same things. Otherwise, when we first started dating, we agreed to read each other's favorite book, and I think he still has not read my favorite book.
So what was it?
My favorite book, I mean, it's not my favorite book, but like from childhood, my favorite book was Jane Eyre. And I asked him to read Jane Eyre, and he asked me to read Clara O'Brien's The Third Policeman, and I did. And I liked it. But I don't think, did you?
I read like 100.
He said I read like 150 pages of it. That's what he just said.
Why am I being asked?
I don't know. Marty no longer wants to be part of the interview.
He's warmed it up. He's warmed it up.
But yeah, for me, Marty's still a very, very important reader. And it's very, yeah, he's a very important reader. And before I send to anyone else.
And there's some way the household is a household in which literature is very much alive.
Yes.
So,
Yes, my child has ranked all the pieces in this book. I can give you the ranking there. He ranks everything.
and he ranked Nocturne, which is the story you read from to begin
Yeah.
with, that's up high.
Yeah, it's like one of the top two. Yeah. Maybe because it starts with him.
Yeah, of course. Okay, well, so I wanted to have you read something to end our part of the discussion before we open reading up the time up to others, and I've changed my mind.
Oh my God. Okay. I was all prepared.
Yeah, well, it's short. It's, because the other thing I want you all to know, although those of you who know Danielle do know this anyway, that she's really funny. And I want you to read writing advice. If you'd be so kind.
I will read writing advice. They make a plan to meet for the first time at a restaurant in a city in which neither of them lives or has ever lived, although the first woman thinks, maybe that's wrong. Maybe the second woman once lived here. The first woman is on the corner of a relatively quiet street, looking at a map on her phone, trying to understand which way she's meant to turn, when the second woman appears. The second woman is wearing a puffy orange jacket and asks for directions to the place they're meant to meet. Well, the first woman says, I am me, and you are you. The second woman jumps up and claps her hands. I didn't recognize you, she says. You look so much older than in your pictures. The first woman doesn't know what to say to that. Prettier, the second woman says, older but prettier. They order $20 bowls of soup. In terms of the decor, it's like someone stuffed a 16th century French palace into a barn and then filled the barn with cacti. Velvet drapes help keep out the cold. At some point, the second woman says to the first, I read your new book, but that is all she says about that. Later, she'll be, the second woman will, picked up in a limousine and taken to a party for a famous novelist who's very old. He's dying. None of it seems real, the second woman says. Her own new book will be a mini-series soon. Over coffee, the second woman says to the first, if you write something with a real story and get it over 200 pages, you can sell it, I promise. But if you keep writing little books that nobody reads, it's like, what's the point, you know? Like, truthfully, where's the impact? After lunch, they walk to a store with bright white walls and a rubber tree plant. The second woman holds up a dress on a shiny metal hanger. I wish you would let me buy you this dress, she says. I would totally buy you this dress. But the second woman can't buy the dress because the first woman has killed her and left her body on the floor. Back out on the street, it smells like snow.
I just love that.
That was the story I was least sure about including.
Oh, I'm glad you included it.
Should we see if anyone else has
Yes, does anybody have a question? I bet they do. I'll hand out the,
If no one has a question, I actually have a question for you all, which is, does anyone in St. Louis actually like their dentist? And if so, I want to know later. After.
Yes.
I see two. Okay. Okay, a few hands. I want to talk to all of you after this. Thank you. That took care of that.
I like the
Okay.
I'm
No.
gonna ask you about your doctor. No, I'm just kidding. I won't. So this seems like a plant that I would ask you a question in public, but it's not. I just want to ask you a question, which is actually for a friend, not me, a friend who just bought all your books, maybe on my recommendation, but wants to know what order to read them in.
Oh my God.
What would you say?
What a weird question. I think go in reverse chronological order. Was that right?
Yeah.
I was right. Kathryn said it.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, I've never even given that a moment's thought before, but that's what Belle told her to do. Okay, good. We were all right.
Way in back there,
Yeah,
can you holler?
Marty's in charge.
This was great.
Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
So I hope I'm getting this correctly, but I think when you were speaking, you said in your writing, in your short story, there's a feeling of strangeness that you're chasing that you think would be impossible or more difficult to chase in a novel. So I wondered if you could speak more about that. Like, why do you think that is, that you're able to capture that feeling of strangeness in a short story as opposed to a novel?
I blame Marty. It's such a good question. I almost want to ask Kathryn, but you never write short stories. I think that part of it is my own sense that, I tend to write really short things. Even my novels are quite short. So I'm not sure that this is a real answer. It's just my own instinct, which is that I think I partly live in fear of trying someone's patience or something. And so the degree to which I want a story to be strange is not something I'm sure is reasonably sustainable over an entire novel space. But then I think of the Silk Road, which I think is really beautiful and quite strange. So I'm not, that's why I'm saying it's like my own instinct, not the truth or something. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, but the Silk Road is in lots of parts.
Yeah.
So I think it is hard to make something strange that goes on and on and on, because those books tend to become insufferable.
Weary. Yeah. But yeah, there's more to it than that that's like very difficult to articulate, but there's something really exciting to me about the short story as a form. Like, it feels like a shape that you can completely see and feel as a writer, and maybe also as a reader, that I don't have the same experience with as a novel. I feel like maybe at the moment it's easier for me to think about stories than novels. Maybe I'll try writing a novel that does that and get back to it. Temperance and Dana? Good fire.
Temperance,
Oh,
And then you can pass it along.
yeah, there you go. What is your relationship to fabric, and what do you think fabric offers to a fictional or atmospheric space? I'm thinking, of course, about the dresses and art, but something about the prairie is so heavily sewn, like not to be using a pun, but it feels like a terrain that feels sort of in conversation with fabric. So I'm just interested in your relationship with fabric.
Oh my gosh. You all are giving me wild questions. I thought you'd be like, what time of day do you write?
You're not gonna get that in this group.
My relationship to fabric in real life, I don't know. So I jokingly mentioned before that I took a fiber arts class, but I was actually really into fiber arts classes when I was at the Art Institute, and thinking about, particularly thinking about weaving and what can be woven, which is like anything. Like you can weave almost anything, and that was part of what's exciting about fiber arts is that anything can be a fiber in a weird way. And so I just keep thinking about that, about like the density that excited me in weaving things and the textures that you're talking about. I mean, people have frequently told me that the textures of my books are quite dense. And so that's interesting. But I don't know, in real life, I'm mostly just like cotton and linen. Not densely woven. I mean, maybe those are densely woven. I don't know.
It depends.
I guess
They can be loosely woven or densely woven.
I have to think about your question more. I'm gonna get back to everyone. Dana, hit me.
Okay. Listening to you talk about your process and the way that you conceive of this book and writing in general sounds so much like a poet. And I'm curious how you would react to that and what role poetry has in your life.
Well, I love poetry and I read poetry, but I have been told in no uncertain terms that I am not a poet by numerous poets. So, and I wasn't sure at first what I was doing, if I was writing stories or poems. And then so I would take classes in both. The MFA I did, you didn't track. So there was no, you didn't align yourself with a genre. But then when I was doing my PhD, you did. But I still kept taking poetry classes, and the poets would be like, no. Yeah, you're definitely not a poet. So I just settled. But also, when I was writing the pieces that made up my first book, that thing I was talking about with Hunka Munka, The Tale of Two Bad Mice, which is what I thought the story was called forever. But that's not what it's called. It's just A Tale of Two Bad Mice. That feeling of time passing actually is integral to the thing I'm trying to make. So it's like, even though I want to put the things that are supposed to be in the background in the foreground of my fiction, I still want that weird, seductive kind of pulse of narrative always moving. And I think that's what finally made me decide I was doing that and being rejected by all points. And also the other piece of it is that at the time that I was sort of starting and my first book came out, I was definitely writing very close to poets and poetry, living in the Front Range where there's a really big poetry community, teaching at Naropa. But it seemed to me, this could be wrong, but it just felt to me like contemporary American poetry was so capacious and that what was allowed to be fiction was so much more narrow, and so it seemed more perverse and funnier to insist that what my book was fiction. It just seemed more productive and provocative to me to do that. But looking back, I still also think it probably is more like fiction, but not completely there.
Hello. I had two questions and one was almost identically to that, so thank you. And now I can just ask you one question. Since you're a professor, I would love to know this thing about narration that you're saying, like being at the background. Are there other authors besides this children's book that I will absolutely look at because I have kids and I want to look this up? I wrote it down. There are other authors who also do that because I'm just trying to place that type of writing in my mind more, and I don't know of any authors. I'd love to know if there's anything that springs to mind.
That's such a good question. Yeah, Christina Rivera Garza does that. I mean, yeah, so I went to a press called Dorothy, and a lot of her authors like that. I mean, I actually do sort of feel some of this. I feel like everyone's just going to give me like weird expressions, but I do. Some of my experience of Virginia Woolf is like this, where there's so much beauty in the language, but also in what's being described, that I feel like I'm watching something as much as following a narrative. So, I had given up teaching Virginia Woolf's Kew Gardens, the short story, because everyone always hated it. I mean, in my fiction 1 classes, not in other classes. And it was just like, it just started to feel too punishing because I love it so much. But that isn't really, the last time I taught it, there was a young person in that class who said, this story is boring, it's just like being in a garden, which I write about in the art section of this book because I was like, first of all, you're wrong. It's an experience in language, so it's not just like being in a garden. But if it was, if a story could be just like being in a garden, that would be insane and so cool that it could not possibly be boring. But I talk about this in the art essay, this exact exchange of this. So I feel like Virginia Woolf, especially Kew Gardens, and this also gets me really interested in, there's a lot of video games and sort of thoughts about virtual reality running through the book. And partly because when I was writing it, my child was really into playing video games. But just that idea that how could something be a garden and be a story at the same time? The closest I could get to it was some of the video game spaces he was moving around inside of. And so that became really interesting as like a layer to add into all of that thinking too. I mean, I'd be like obsessing about prairies and he'd be like, there's this thing called a chorus plant forest. And a chorus plant can grow up into the sky for infinity. And my brain would just start exploding. So, and it like apparently makes sounds if you're inside. Does anyone in here know where you would find a chorus plant forest? See, we all need my child. It's in Minecraft. Anyway, so yeah, I will. Any last questions?
Now they all have to buy books. Go buy books.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our guests. We have Danielle's books, Kathryn's books, as well as a selection from Dorothy Publishing available for sale. So if you haven't gotten your books yet, head to the desk. We're gonna get some books signed as well. So give me a second to move some chairs around. I think we're gonna kind of do a line back to this way. So thank you all so much for coming.